Sarah Martinez never imagined that her assignment as a foreign correspondent would turn into a fight for survival. The 28-year-old journalist had covered conflicts in 3 different countries, but Afghanistan felt different from the moment she stepped off the transport plane in Kabul. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound where she would spend the next 6 weeks documenting the humanitarian crisis affecting local villages. Sarah had volunteered for this assignment because she believed in telling the stories that others wouldn't touch. Her editor back in New York had warned her about the dangers, but Sarah felt confident in her experience and the security protocols that were supposed to protect her. The first 2 weeks passed without major incident. Sarah worked alongside her translator, Ahmad, a local man who had risked his own safety to help foreign journalists understand the complex situation. Together, they interviewed families who had lost everything, children who had never known peace, and aid workers who continued their mission despite constant threats. Sarah's reports were powerful, bringing attention to the forgotten corners of human suffering. Her photographs captured moments of both despair and hope, showing the world what was happening in villages that had been cut off from outside help for months. The international response to her work was immediate, with donations pouring in to support the relief efforts. But success in journalism often comes with a price. Sarah's reporting had attracted attention from groups who preferred to operate in the shadows, away from the scrutinizing eyes of the international media. Unknown to her, several local commanders had begun discussing the problem of the American journalist who was asking too many questions and taking too many pictures. On a Wednesday morning in her 3rd week, Sarah noticed changes in the behavior of some locals. People who had been friendly and open suddenly avoided eye contact. Children who had eagerly posed for photos now scattered when they saw her camera. Ahmad tried to reassure her that these mood changes were normal, but his own nervousness was becoming harder to hide. The compound where Sarah stayed housed several international aid workers and was supposedly protected by local security forces. The guards at the gate carried aging rifles and seemed more interested in their card games than watching for threats. Sarah had mentioned her concerns about security in her daily check-ins with her news agency, but was told that moving her to a different location would be too risky. That evening, as Sarah uploaded her latest batch of photos and prepared her next report, she received an encrypted message from her editor. Intelligence sources had picked up chatter about a possible threat to foreign journalists in her area. The message advised her to maintain low visibility and consider cutting her assignment short. Sarah stared at her laptop screen, weighing her options. She had 2 more interviews scheduled with village elders, who had finally agreed to speak about corruption in the local government's distribution of aid supplies. These were the kinds of sources that could take months to cultivate, and their stories needed to be told. The journalist in her couldn't walk away from such important work. She decided to stay but agreed to take extra precautions. Sarah would limit her movements outside the compound and conduct interviews within the secured area when possible. She also arranged for Ahmad to scout locations before any field trips, and to maintain constant communication with the compound security chief. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah felt the familiar mix of excitement and anxiety that came with important journalism. She was uncovering stories that mattered, stories that could make a difference in people's lives. The risks were real, but she had faced dangerous situations before and always found a way to stay safe while getting the story. Outside her window, the sounds of the Afghan night continued as they had for centuries. Dogs barked in the distance and the occasional vehicle rumbled past on the main road. Sarah had no way of knowing that in a building less than 2 miles away, a group of armed men were finalizing plans that would change her life forever. The next morning would bring events that would test everything Sarah thought she knew about survival, courage, and the lengths that others would go to protect someone they had never met. Her commitment to telling important stories was about to put her in a situation where the story would become about her own fight to stay alive. The attack came at dawn, when the compound was at its most vulnerable. Sarah woke to the sound of gunfire and shouting in multiple languages. Through her small window, she could see muzzle flashes in the gray morning light and figures moving between the buildings. Ahmad burst through her door without knocking, his face pale with terror. He grabbed her backpack and started throwing her essential items into it, while speaking rapidly in broken English. The compound was under siege by a local militant group that had been monitoring her activities for weeks. They wanted her alive, which made the situation both better and worse than a random attack. The security guards at the compound had either fled or been overwhelmed in the first minutes of the assault. Sarah could hear voices getting closer to her building, speaking in urgent tones that needed no translation. Ahmad pushed her toward the back exit, explaining that he had arranged for a vehicle to take them to a safer location outside the city. They ran through a maze of back alleys and side streets, with Ahmad leading the way and Sarah struggling to keep up while carrying her camera equipment and laptop. The sounds of the attack grew fainter behind them, but Ahmad kept looking over his shoulder with increasing concern. When they reached the designated meeting point, the vehicle was nowhere to be found. For 2 hours, they waited in an abandoned building while Ahmad tried to contact his network of helpers through text messages and coded phone calls. Sarah used the time to send what she feared might be her final report to her editor, explaining the situation and providing details about the compound attack. She also uploaded her most recent photos to a cloud server, ensuring that the story she had gathered would survive even if she didn't. When Ahmad finally received a response, the news was devastating. The driver who was supposed to help them had been arrested at a checkpoint and several other members of their support network had gone silent. They were essentially on their own in a city where Sarah's presence had become a liability for anyone who tried to help her. The decision to leave the building came when they spotted armed men conducting a systematic search of the surrounding area. Ahmad had one more contact who might be able to help, but reaching him would require traveling through the most dangerous part of the city during daylight hours when Sarah would be easily recognizable. They spent the next 6 hours moving from one hiding place to another, staying ahead of the search teams by minutes rather than hours. Sarah's comfortable life as a journalist had not prepared her for the physical demands of running for her life. Her expensive hiking boots rubbed blisters on her feet, and her camera bag felt like it weighed 50 pounds after the first mile. By afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of the city, but their situation had become more desperate rather than better. Ahmad's final contact had been forced to leave the area, and they were now in territory controlled by the same group that had attacked the compound. Worse still, Ahmad had received word that there was a substantial bounty on Sarah's head, making it unlikely that they would find help from locals. They took shelter in an abandoned farmhouse as the sun began to set, both exhausted and running low on water. Ahmad tried to maintain optimism, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. He had risked everything to help her, and now both their lives were in danger because of her work. That evening, as they shared their last energy bar and discussed their dwindling options, Sarah made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of trying to flee the country immediately, she wanted to continue documenting what was happening to them. If they were captured or killed, she wanted there to be a record of how local people like Ahmad had risked everything to help foreign journalists tell important stories. Using her satellite phone's limited battery, Sarah recorded several video messages explaining their situation and praising Ahmad's courage. She also continued taking photographs, capturing the reality of what it meant to be hunted in a foreign land with no official protection. As night fell completely, they could see vehicle lights moving in a search pattern across the landscape. The net was closing around them, and they both knew that morning would likely bring a confrontation they were not equipped to handle. Sarah had always believed that good journalism was worth taking risks for, but she was about to discover whether her commitment to the truth would cost her life. Neither of them knew that thousands of miles away, Sarah's editor had activated emergency protocols that would eventually bring help from an unexpected source. The wheels of a rescue operation were already turning, but whether help would arrive in time was a question that would be answered in the harsh light of the coming dawn. 3,000 miles away in a secure communications center in Virginia, Sarah's desperate situation had triggered a chain of events that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Her editor, Michael Chen, had spent 18 hours making phone calls and pulling in favors from contacts throughout the government and military communities. The breakthrough came when Michael reached out to Colonel James Morrison, a retired Marine officer who now worked as a consultant for media organizations operating in hostile territories. Morrison had connections throughout the special operations community and understood both the urgency of Sarah's situation and the political complexities of mounting a rescue operation in Afghanistan. Morrison's first call was to his former colleague, Navy Commander Lisa Torres, who now oversaw special operations coordination for the region. Torres listened carefully as Morrison explained that an American journalist was trapped behind enemy lines with no official government support and no realistic hope of escape through normal channels. The conversation that followed involved careful diplomatic language, but the message was clear. While the government could not officially authorize a rescue mission for a private citizen who had entered a dangerous area against State Department advice, they also could not ignore credible intelligence about an American in immediate danger. Commander Torres made her own series of calls, eventually reaching Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan, who led a SEAL team currently stationed at a forward operating base less than 200 miles from Sarah's last known location. Sullivan and his team had been conducting reconnaissance missions in the region and were familiar with the local terrain and threat environment. The initial briefing was conducted through encrypted channels, with Morrison providing all available intelligence about Sarah's situation, including her last known coordinates and the nature of the forces searching for her. The militant group holding the area was well equipped but not particularly sophisticated, which created both opportunities and risks for any rescue attempt. Sullivan assembled his team of 6 experienced operators and began planning what would officially be classified as a training exercise. The mission would require them to penetrate hostile territory, locate 2 civilians who might be anywhere within a 20-square-mile area, and extract them without engaging in combat that could create international incidents. Meanwhile, Sarah and Ahmad spent another terrifying night in the abandoned farmhouse, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to rest. As dawn approached, they could see that the search pattern had tightened significantly. Vehicles were now positioned at regular intervals around their area, making any attempt to move extremely dangerous. Ahmad received one final message on his phone from a cousin who lived in a village 30 miles away. The message was brief but chilling. The local commander had announced a reward equivalent to 5 years' wages for information leading to the capture of the American journalist. With that kind of money at stake, they could not trust anyone they might encounter. Sarah continued documenting their ordeal, but her equipment was running low on battery power, and they had no way to recharge anything. She took what she expected to be her final photographs that morning, capturing the view from their hiding place and the fear in Ahmad's eyes as he watched the approaching search teams. At exactly 10:30 that morning, Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from her editor. The text was cryptic but unmistakable. "Weather forecast shows clearing skies tonight. Stay put and watch for sunrise." Sarah stared at the message, trying to understand what Michael could possibly mean. Ahmad thought the message might be code for some kind of rescue attempt, but Sarah had trouble believing that anyone could reach them in their current situation. The militant forces had demonstrated sophisticated organization and local knowledge that would make any rescue extremely difficult. As the day progressed, the search teams came dangerously close to their position several times. On 2 occasions, Sarah and Ahmad had to crawl into a root cellar beneath the farmhouse while armed men searched the buildings above them. The space was cramped and airless, but it kept them hidden during the most dangerous moments. By late afternoon, they had finished their last water and were beginning to face the reality that they might not survive another night. Ahmad suggested that they might have better chances if they separated, allowing him to create a distraction while Sarah tried to escape in a different direction. Sarah refused to let him sacrifice himself for her safety, but she appreciated the courage behind his offer. As evening approached, both of them noticed changes in the search pattern. The vehicles seemed to be consolidating into larger groups, and radio chatter from the militant forces suggested that something had shifted in their operational plans. Neither Sarah nor Ahmad could understand what was happening, but they sensed that their situation was about to change dramatically. The sun set with no sign of the sunrise that Michael's message had promised, leaving Sarah and Ahmad to wonder if help was really coming, or if they would face their final night alone in the Afghan wilderness. Unknown to them, 6 highly trained operators were already moving through the darkness toward their location, equipped with technology and skills that would soon turn the tables on their pursuers. Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan and his 5-man SEAL team had been moving through hostile territory for 6 hours when they reached the ridge overlooking Sarah's last known position. Using night vision equipment and thermal imaging, they could see the layout of the search operation that had trapped the journalist and her translator. The militant forces had positioned themselves in a loose perimeter around the abandoned farmhouse, with roving patrols and stationary observation posts creating multiple layers of security. Sullivan counted at least 24 armed fighters, along with 6 vehicles that could be used to rapidly reinforce any position that came under attack. Petty Officer First Class Maria Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, established contact with their forward operating base and confirmed that they had located the target area. The mission parameters were clear but challenging. Extract 2 civilians without engaging in sustained combat that could escalate into a larger conflict. Sullivan studied the tactical situation through his scope, identifying the strongest and weakest points in the enemy perimeter. The farmhouse where Sarah and Ahmad were hiding sat in a shallow depression that provided some concealment but also created a natural trap. Any rescue attempt would require the team to get very close to multiple hostile positions. Senior Chief Petty Officer David Kim, the team's most experienced operator, pointed out that the militant forces were showing signs of fatigue after maintaining their search operation for more than 36 hours. Some of the sentries were clearly struggling to stay alert, and the patrol patterns had become predictable rather than random. The plan that emerged from their tactical discussion was risky but achievable. The team would split into 2 elements, with Sullivan leading 3 operators in a direct approach to the farmhouse while Kim took the remaining 2 men to create a diversion that would draw attention away from the extraction point. Exactly 11:15, Kim's element began their diversion by triggering a series of small explosive charges they had placed along a secondary road half a mile from the farmhouse. The explosions were designed to sound like an attack by a rival militant group, complete with distinctive weapon signatures that would suggest a specific type of assault. The reaction was immediate and exactly what Sullivan had hoped for. More than half of the fighters surrounding the farmhouse broke contact and moved toward the apparent attack, leaving gaps in the perimeter that the extraction team could exploit. Vehicle-mounted weapons were repositioned to face the new threat, creating blind spots that hadn't existed moments before. Sullivan's element moved with practiced precision through the darkness, using the confusion to advance to within 50 meters of the farmhouse without detection. Each operator knew his role and moved with the silent efficiency that came from years of training and combat experience. Inside the farmhouse, Sarah and Ahmad heard the explosions and saw vehicle lights moving rapidly in multiple directions. They had no way of knowing whether this represented a rescue attempt or simply fighting between rival groups. But Sarah decided to risk using her satellite phone to send a brief status update to her editor. The response came back within minutes. "Sunrise is here. Be ready to move when you see green light." Sarah showed the message to Ahmad, who nodded grimly and gathered their few remaining supplies. Whatever was about to happen, they needed to be prepared to act quickly. Sullivan and his team reached the farmhouse perimeter just as Kim's diversion reached its peak intensity. The remaining guards were focused entirely on the distant explosions and radio chatter from their scattered comrades. The SEAL team leader made the decision to accelerate the timeline, rather than wait for the situation to settle. Using hand signals, Sullivan directed his operators to neutralize the 2 remaining sentries through non-lethal means. The guards were unconscious before they realized they were under attack, allowing the team to establish a secure perimeter around the farmhouse without raising any alarms. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Thompson, the team's medic and demolitions expert, approached the farmhouse door and tapped out a specific pattern that had been included in the coded message to Sarah's editor. Inside the building, Sarah heard the tapping and recognized the rhythm as Morse code spelling out USA. When Sarah carefully opened the door, she found herself face to face with a figure in full combat gear, whose night vision goggles made him look like something from science fiction. Thompson identified himself as American military and explained that they had very little time to reach an extraction point before the diversion ended and hostile forces returned to the area. Ahmad was initially suspicious of the sudden appearance of American soldiers, but Sarah convinced him that this was their only realistic chance of escape. They gathered their essential items and prepared to leave the farmhouse that had been both shelter and prison for the past terrifying day. As they stepped into the night, Sarah realized that her story was taking another unexpected turn. Instead of becoming a victim of the conflict she had come to document, she was now part of a military operation that demonstrated the extraordinary lengths that people would go to protect someone who was simply trying to tell the truth about what was happening in forgotten corners of the world. The extraction began immediately, with Sullivan's team forming a protective formation around Sarah and Ahmad as they moved away from the farmhouse. The SEAL operators communicated through nearly silent hand signals and advanced infrared systems that allowed them to coordinate their movements without making any sound that could alert nearby hostile forces. Sarah struggled to keep pace with the operators, who moved through the rough terrain with an efficiency that came from years of specialized training. Ahmad proved surprisingly capable at moving quietly, his familiarity with the local landscape helping him anticipate obstacles that might slow their progress. After covering nearly 2 miles through rocky terrain and dried creek beds, they reached the designated extraction point where Kim's diversion element was waiting with additional equipment. The reunion was brief but professional, with Kim reporting that the diversion had successfully drawn most of the hostile forces away from their route but would not fool them for much longer. The extraction point was a flat area suitable for helicopter landing, but Sullivan had decided against using rotary wing aircraft due to the noise signature and the risk of drawing attention from other militant groups in the region. Instead, they would move overland to a secure position where ground vehicles could safely pick them up. Rodriguez established communication with their support elements and confirmed that 2 armored vehicles were en route to a rally point approximately 8 miles from their current position. The vehicles would arrive in exactly 90 minutes, giving the team a narrow window to cover difficult terrain while avoiding the search teams that were already beginning to realize they had been deceived. The next phase of the movement required crossing an exposed valley, where they would be vulnerable to observation and long-range weapons. Sullivan made the decision to split the group again, with half the team moving first to establish overwatch positions while the others escorted the civilians across the dangerous ground. Sarah had covered conflict zones as a journalist for 5 years, but she had never experienced anything like the intensity and precision of a special operations mission. Every movement was calculated, every pause had a purpose, and the operators seemed to anticipate threats and opportunities that were invisible to her untrained eyes. Halfway across the valley, Kim spotted vehicle lights moving in a search pattern that would intersect their route within minutes. The team immediately shifted to an alternate path that took them through rougher terrain, but kept them concealed from the approaching hostile forces. Ahmad proved invaluable during this phase, using his knowledge of local farming practices to guide them through irrigation ditches and terraced fields that provided concealment while allowing them to maintain their pace toward the extraction point. His courage and quick thinking had already saved their lives multiple times during the past 2 days. As they climbed toward higher ground on the far side of the valley, Sarah began to believe that they might actually escape. The professionalism and skill of the SEAL team had transformed what seemed like an impossible situation into a carefully executed operation with a realistic chance of success. But their relief was premature. Rodriguez received an urgent communication from their support elements warning that a large hostile force was moving rapidly toward the planned extraction point. Intelligence sources indicated that the militants had realized the diversion was fake and were now conducting a more systematic search of the entire region. Sullivan gathered his team, leaders, for a quick tactical discussion while Sarah and Ahmad rested behind a rocky outcropping. The new intelligence meant that their original extraction plan was no longer viable, and they would need to reach an alternate pickup point that was farther away and more difficult to defend. The alternate extraction site was the abandoned military checkpoint on a hilltop that offered good fields of fire but would require them to climb nearly 1,000 feet of elevation through terrain that provided little concealment. Worse still, the checkpoint was a known landmark that hostile forces might choose to monitor as a likely escape route. Thompson volunteered to move ahead and conduct reconnaissance of the checkpoint, while the rest of the team continued toward the rally point with the civilians. His report came back within 30 minutes. The checkpoint was currently unoccupied but showed signs of recent use, and several potential approach routes were available. As they began the climb toward the checkpoint, Sarah reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just 3 days. She had come to Afghanistan to document the struggles of people caught in an endless conflict, but now she was living that struggle herself and depending on the courage of strangers to survive. The sounds of search helicopters echoed across the valley behind them, and vehicle lights could be seen moving in coordinated patterns that suggested their pursuers were getting closer. The race to reach the extraction point had become a matter of life and death, with the outcome depending on whether help would arrive before their enemies figured out where they were going. Ahmad looked back toward the lights and vehicles searching the area they had just left, then turned to Sarah with the expression of determination rather than fear. He had risked everything to help her tell important stories, and now American soldiers were risking their lives to save them both. The courage that people showed for each other, even across cultural and national boundaries, was perhaps the most important story of all. The final approach to the abandoned checkpoint tested everyone's endurance and nerves. Sarah's legs shook from exhaustion as she climbed the steep, rocky slope, but Thompson stayed close beside her, offering quiet encouragement and occasionally helping her navigate the most difficult sections. Ahmad moved with renewed energy, perhaps drawing strength from the possibility that their ordeal might finally be ending. He had shown remarkable courage throughout their escape, risking his own safety to help someone whose storytelling mission had put them both in mortal danger. When they reached the checkpoint, Sullivan and Kim immediately began establishing defensive positions, while Rodriguez attempted to contact their extraction vehicles. The hilltop provided excellent visibility of the surrounding area, but it also made them visible to anyone who might be looking in their direction. The abandoned checkpoint consisted of several concrete barriers and a small building that had been damaged by previous fighting. Thompson quickly determined that the structure could provide adequate cover if they came under attack, while also offering multiple escape routes if their position became untenable. Rodriguez's radio crackled with the news they had been hoping for. The extraction vehicles were 10 minutes out and approaching through a route that appeared to be clear of hostile forces. But the good news was tempered by reports that search helicopters were expanding their coverage area and might spot the checkpoint before the rescue could be completed. Sullivan made the decision to use infrared strobes to mark their position for the extraction vehicles, accepting the risk that the signals might also be detected by hostile forces. The alternative was to rely on radio communication alone, which could result in the vehicles missing the checkpoint in the darkness. As the sound of approaching engines grew louder, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. After 3 days of terror and uncertainty, rescue was finally within reach. She thought about the stories she still needed to tell and the photographs that documented both the human cost of conflict and the extraordinary courage that people showed in the worst circumstances. The first armored vehicle appeared on the access road exactly when promised, followed 30 seconds later by a second vehicle that would provide additional security for the extraction. Both vehicles were equipped with heavy weapons and advanced communications gear that would allow them to coordinate with air support if necessary. The loading process took less than 2 minutes, with the SEAL team maintaining security while Sarah and Ahmad climbed into the second vehicle. Thompson performed a quick medical assessment of both civilians, determining that they were exhausted and dehydrated, but had no serious injuries that would require immediate treatment. As the vehicles pulled away from the checkpoint, Sarah watched through the small window as the hilltop faded into the darkness behind them. The place where her rescue had been completed would always hold special meaning as the spot where she had regained her freedom and her future. The drive to the forward operating base took 90 minutes through terrain that was secured by additional military units that had been positioned to support the extraction. Sarah learned that her rescue had involved dozens of personnel and significant resources, all mobilized to save someone whose only crime had been trying to tell important stories about forgotten people. Upon reaching the base, Sarah was debriefed by intelligence officers who were interested in her observations about militant activities in the region. Her journalist's eye for detail and her access to local sources provided valuable information that would help protect other international personnel working in the area. Ahmad was offered resettlement assistance that would allow him to leave Afghanistan with his family, recognizing that his help to foreign journalists had made him a target for retaliation. His courage and loyalty had saved Sarah's life, but it had also put his own family at risk in ways that required ongoing protection. During her final night at the base before flying back to the United States, Sarah spent several hours writing about her experience and the people who had risked their lives to save her. The story was no longer just about the humanitarian crisis she had come to document, but about the bonds of human decency that transcended nationality, culture, and personal risk. The SEAL team that had rescued her was already preparing for their next mission, treating the successful extraction as just another day's work in their ongoing mission to protect American interests and citizens around the world. Their professionalism and courage had turned what could have been a tragic ending into a story of hope and international cooperation. Sarah's plane lifted off from Kabul airport 72 hours after her rescue, carrying her back to a world that suddenly seemed much safer and more precious than it had before her ordeal. She carried with her not just the story she had originally come to tell, but a deeper understanding of the courage that ordinary people showed in extraordinary circumstances. The experience had changed her perspective on journalism, risk, and the responsibility that came with telling stories from dangerous places. She would continue reporting on conflicts and humanitarian crises, but with a new appreciation for the people who made such work possible and the networks of courage that operated in the shadows to protect those who bore witness to the world's troubles.